here we are. Right. Okay, here we are. Here we are at the end of the term. It's time to take a look at what's going to be on the final exam for our class. And so let's just jump into it so we don't run out of time, so I can tell you what you're going to have to know. So away we go, folks. Final exam review. And just to remind you that it's coming up this Thursday. Just like it did before, we will be, it will operate for the 7 days, as it were. So March 13th through March 20th. And it is still going to be at the testing center. Nothing's changed there. If you took the midterm there, you can take the final there. And it does close Thursday. There's no grace period. You're going to have to get it all done by next Thursday because there are no makeup exams. And they are open on Saturdays, so check the Saturday hours. And it's probably, I think it's probably, you know, it's to everyone's advantage to take it early. And if you can, make it during the Saturday, and then you're done. And you don't have to fight with any other students because this is final exam week for everybody. So they will be crowded. Okay, it's the same thing. It is the, if you put it all together, you will have taken 100 questions about the American cinema. This is the second half of that. Again, there'll be 50 questions. It will be an objective exam, just as we had before. And study guides are now available online. You can download the study guide for the final on Moodle. I think this time around you will like how that study guide has been put together. It's a little bit different from the previous one, and so I'll leave it at that. All right. Remember that you need photo ID to take the exam, and again, you are allowed one 3x5 note card. And always, always, always be sure to check and verify the hours of the testing lab. Again, just let me remind you that this is the final exam time for everybody. And so the place will be packed. So let's move on. Oh, yeah, comment about the extra credit. If you do plan on turning in extra credit, it is due on March 18th. So that'll be a week from tomorrow. And you can just turn it in to me at my office. If I'm not there for some reason, if I've stepped out for whatever reason, just put it under the door. I'll find it. But it's always best to hand it to me. Don't put it in my mailbox or put it someplace. And if you do leave it under the door, make sure and send an email saying I was there and you were gone, but I put it under the door so that I'll know that yes, okay, I'll be looking for it. So your extra credit is due March 18th. If you're going to mail it, you know, it's got to be in by a postmark there March 14th, but hardly anybody mails it anymore. And because you can just attach it to email as well. Attach it separately as a Word document, and everybody will be happy. Okay, moving on. This is what you need to know. We're doing everything from the midterm to the end of the quarter. So we're going to go through everything of the combat film all the way through to the edge of Hollywood, which is going on this week. And let's see. The combat war film, what you need to know about that is law and morality is suspended. Remember they talked about that. At time of war, you know, we control everything you do. Morality is suspended. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And the combat war film, it switches in this one from the individual to the group, and that is to the troops. This is significant because it works against what is given to us in the Western. The Western, the emphasis is always on the rugged individual. And what's interesting is when we think of Westerns and we think of war films, we think of John Wayne. So he plays both parts in something like this. He plays both the rugged individual, but that individualism changes when he goes to war. Also, women as emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. Okay, when you have a war film, you know, I mean, part of the Hollywood format, or formula, that is, the Hollywood formula is you always have men and women in the films, you know. You have to have some kind of romance or some kind of, there has to be something for women to identify with in films. So even when you have a film about war, and in this particular era, when women did not go into combat, were nowhere near the front other than they served as nurses or something of that nature, what happens is they do bring in a softer side to humanity. And that in itself then brings out some male vulnerability. Okay, the combat war film also recognized the anti-war sentiments that you find in post-war films. We'll get to the Office of War Information in a moment, but for the most part, the films that were made during the war are very much pro-war. Now, what they mean by that and what you actually see in those films is that they are pro-defense. That is, our cause is right and just, and we're defending ourselves against invaders. The war films and their portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces, our series discussed that. We don't see too much of that during the actual wartime. This comes out later in the post-war films again. Once the war is over, once things are settling down, then the filmmakers take on a little different view of how war affects individuals. And so they take on things such as racial integration, you know, the idea of that, well, Truman won't do that until, 47 or 48 when he actually integrates the armed forces. But previous to that, we have segregation. But the post-war films take on just a different attitude. As I stated earlier, the fundamental philosophy or ideology that we find in the American war film is by that statement right there. We may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So that's kind of an important aspect of defining American war films, is the sense, again, as I mentioned earlier, about defense, the idea that we are defending ourselves and our way of life from invaders who would come and turn that upside down. As such, of course, in a more modern era, we look back on that time and think of it in naive terms, and I think that's the wrong way to look at them. Okay, moving on, we go to the Office of War Information. This was the role of the United States government in Hollywood film production. Essentially, propaganda. That's essentially what it was. It was shaping public opinion, making films that essentially were pushing that idea that it is right that we are at war. It is right that we are defending ourselves. And much of that is shown with what they call the Sergeant York formula, which depicts the conversion of an objector to a supporter. Sergeant York, Gary Cooper made the film, and during the war, Sergeant York is the decorated hero of the First World War, and he was an objector. He was opposed to the war, but he goes to war, and when he sees the horrors of war, and he sees an enemy that is trying to destroy the American way of life or destroy whatever in the sense of right and wrong, then he becomes a supporter of that and comes out and defends our position. Now, that was used, it's an interesting point, but we don't have a lot of war films made during World War II that show that. Most of the stuff during World War II was plain out propaganda. It's time. And I just have to bring this up. I just have to point this one out because there is one film made during the war that does this, is a perfect example of this because it is in the extreme. And it is a film with Tarzan. It's a Tarzan film, and Tarzan in the jungles of Africa doesn't want anything to do with people, and he doesn't want anything to do with the war. And it's not until the Nazis take claim of the African tribes and make gestures to kidnap Jane that Tarzan decides, okay, now it's time that I make war. There is it's a fantastic scene in that movie, and it's one of those, I wish I could be there at the time when it was shown in theaters, because he's a pacifist through this whole movie until the Nazis are doing their ugly stuff, and that there's the camera comes in close on Tarzan when he's changing his allegiance here, when he's becoming a supporter, and he just looks towards the camera and he just says, "Now Tarzan, make war." And you just know if you get Tarzan mad at you, you're doomed. Okay, moving on into the film noir. The question is always asked, is film noir a true genre? Film noir is a term that the French used. It means, as it says there, a black film. And the reason that they coined that and applied it to these films is because of the way it looked. So essentially what they're talking about here when they describe it as a black film or a dark film is the way it looked. The films were shot usually at night. You've got all of these scenes that take place in the middle of a city at night with all of that wonderful chiaroscuro lighting effects that you get with it. And so the question then comes back was, well, are they really describing a style, a way it looks, or are they really describing it as its own genre? Well, we do know that they are mostly adaptations of American pulp fiction of the time. They are what we used to call, and I guess we still call them today, I don't know, I haven't heard this term too often, but in the good old days, we used to refer to these as hard-boiled detectives. So they're hard-boiled novels. They're tough guys. Again, as it states there, discovered and debuted in post-war France. That is, what that means is that the French critics found these films and began to describe them, and so we end up with a certain kind of film, which is what genre is, and so we look at them with that kind of an eye towards what these films are all about. And what are they all about? What we see is the settings first. They're always urban. You find them right in the middle, downtown city. And often, more often than not, really, it's raining. They are rain-slicked streets. And of course, that's part of the reason for that. It creates a good photograph, you know, when we're filming this sort of thing. It gives you that beautiful chiaroscuro effect. And also, it is the sleazy side of city life. This is not a place that you really want to hang out, although I've known many students who've said, hey, man, I'd love to live down there in that crazy place. And it's because it's often stylized. But it is the sleazy side of city life. It is the place that you find all of the prostitutes, the drug addicts. You find the thieves and the crooks, and often your tough guy cop, well, he's not a cop, detective, private detective, your tough guy is pretty much an anti-hero in that regard, that the only reason he is the good guy is because he's not quite as bad as the people he's dealing with. The themes: alienation, that usually your tough guy detective is a loner. He's alienated from everybody else. He's very much just simply a guy that keeps to himself, but he does have a sense of right and wrong. He does have a moral character to him, which when he sees something that's wrong, he's going to right it. There is also existentialism that permeates these films, a sense that you cannot escape this world, that it's just going to perpetuate itself. It just continues on. The character types that we find in these films: amnesiacs. You find people that can't remember who they are. My favorite film noir, it focuses on an amnesiac. The antisocial loners, again, we mentioned that. And the significant thing here is the private detective, and what's significant is to underscore that word private. These are not police officials. What they are they work for themselves. That is, they offer themselves services to people and go out and do whatever they have to do, solve a crime or find somebody or whatever. But at the same time, again, as I mentioned earlier, they still have this sense of morality. They still see right and wrong. And what happens is, in many cases, we never see any money exchange. Nobody ever really hires these guys. Often, it's something that inspires them. Someone will come in and say, I need you to find this or do this or whatever. And then they'll go, okay, and then they just can't stop until they solve the issue, whatever it may be. Now, the style is usually what most of us like when we watch these films. There's low-key lighting. There are lots of shadowy elements, strange highlights, and the camera angles are often extreme. They're high. Often they're very much low angles on characters, and distortion. What they call Dutch angles. At times they're just tilted a little bit. Again, our question, when we go back, is it a true genre? What I just described here with regard to film style, that's Citizen Kane. So the question, is Citizen Kane film noir? Probably not. But it has a film noir style even before we start making film noir. So the style, you see, the style can be in other films. The style also very much, as if you've seen these, the old style Universal type, Universal horror movies, the Universal Pictures, you know, those kind of horror movies. A lot of those have the same kind of style. So it is probably more, when we're talking, it is a true genre than just simply a style. Also, our series was quick to point out the production code in film noir. These films are quite a bit more mature, you might say. I hate to use that, but with regard to the subjects, it often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. And the gender issues and film noir are women as femme fatales. In our more recent times, more film criticism, feminist criticism, they found in film noir what you have here is a very, very strong female character. And the female character often is in control of everything. Look at Double Indemnity is a perfect example of this, where she absolutely controls everything that the Fred McMurray, I can't remember the character's name, but it's Fred McMurray, the issues, the criminal issues involved. And another film which has the unbelievably strong character is in Detour, with a very weak male figure. All right. In summary then, film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality, meaning this: it's the modern mass American culture, and consumerism, and the disillusionment with Paradise Lost. That's how our film series concluded it in dealing with film noir, and I would agree it is commenting on where we've come. A lot of things probably, and I think it's true, a lot of things took time off when we went to war, and this just picked up more on this idea of what our culture was becoming, very much involved in seeing masses and in consumerism, selling things and buying things and pushing things, getting all the things that we just absolutely have to have but we don't need, and this disillusionment with Paradise Lost. So in many respects, what you have here with film noir is a sort of the answer to the Western, in just the opposite end of it, that rugged individualism with the idea of going out and eking out your own living, and with the idea that I have found paradise in the wide open spaces that through the cities, which grew, that is just canceled by film noir. All right, moving on into film in the television age. There is a post-war decline in attendance. It's a very interesting statistic to see that in 1946, even with all the stuff that we like to point out today, when you take all the factors, and we had the highest attendance, movie attendance ever in 1946, after the war ended. Everybody came home. What they all did, they went to the movies. And then in 1947, you had the worst attendance. They didn't go anymore. So what was going on? Most of the time, the answer is television, but that's not the only culprit. Because in post-war America, we had more leisure time, we had more money, and we suddenly had interest in other activities. And I mentioned way back when, during our orientation session, that the most popular pastime at that time was bowling. And then you had migration to the suburbs. So there was sprawl. Well, along comes TV anyway, and we can't ignore that, because in the beginning, motion pictures and the motion picture industry and the TV industry did not like each other. They hated each other, and they would not speak to each other. As a matter of fact, the motion picture industry as a creative force was centered in Hollywood, whereas the TV industry as a creative force was centered in New York. But soon, the movies saw that TV did something that nobody else can do. It can sell commercials. And so the TV becomes a subsidiary market for motion pictures. The movie industry's response to competition from television and decline in attendance were really the first thing. The response to TV was technical innovations. You can see things in the movies that you can't see on those dinky little screens at home. And so what they did was they went into widescreen. The first real biggie was 3D, which was throwing things at you. And so you get to see all these early 3D movies in which everything you can think of comes flying at you. And then the other biggie was what they called Cinerama, which were these incredibly huge circular type screens in which you could see things peripherally. It was putting you into the picture. They then squeezed it down a little bit into CinemaScope, in which you get pretty much just what we think of today with widescreen, although CinemaScope is a lot wider. and Panavision, which replaced CinemaScope for technical reasons. CinemaScope and Panavision are essentially the same thing, except that Panavision had better lenses and it replaced the CinemaScope. But the important thing there is aspect ratio. What we have here is width to height of a projected image. So instead of having a square image, which is what most people saw in theaters, you now were getting a wide image. And TV, of course, continued to give you the square picture. And so a lot of the films that were made during the 1950s found themselves in trouble when they were released to TV. And that's when you came up with these idiotic things like panning and scanning. And then they decided, well, we want to keep the whole frame, so we letterboxed them and all of that. So those are things that you should know. And there were creative innovations by independent producers at the time. A small company, I mean, a company that actually, as a lot of movie companies were going out of business, here comes one that is a new business and enters into it because it saw a market and met that market. It was a teenage market. Most of the audience members at this time were teenagers. And of course, also you have a sudden proliferation of drive-in movies, passion pits for teenagers. So you start making these certain kinds of films that appeal to teenagers. And also monsters. The low-budget exploitation, mostly made by independent producers that were making tons and tons of money. When you can make a film which you combine monsters and teenagers, you're bound to be successful. And so when American International did that with a movie called I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and spent like $70,000 making the film and earning something like $5 million off that investment, soon everybody else was doing the same thing. So you have monster movies, the old style horror movies that now have a new element, teenagers. Okay, the film school generation. Okay, that's the two 1960s. It happens at that time. There is a transition from the older generation movies like Rock Hudson, Doris Day, and a sex comedy called Lover Come Back, all the way at the end of that decade with a sex comedy called The Graduate. Quite a bit of difference there. I'm not going to jump through all of those hoops here, but it's this film school generation, they grow up at a time of the counterculture movement. There's the war. We've already talked about the parents' war, which was the good war versus Vietnam, the bad war. So there are all this conflict that goes on. The socio-political climate of the U.S. You've got JFK's assassination, then you get LBJ, then you have Martin Luther King leading the civil rights movement, then you got Kennedy's brother, and then you get Nixon. And then you got university protests, the nonviolent activism and violent eruptions and all of that. And then the craziness of the era with assassinations. The streets are, you know, these film noir places are now places of riots. And you have public figures being gunned down. And then the women's lib takes over. And there's a sexual revolution. The workforce changes. You do all of this madness. The image of women change, and I'm not going to read through all of that, we'll run out of time, but just to highlight this, you know, you have these exploitation films that start to exploit sex, drugs, violence, horror, and when talking about horror, we're meaning ghastly horror. We're not just talking about gothic trappings, but we're talking about repugnance, you know, things that are really gruesome. You get blaxploitation. And then that brings us, we'll go through all of that. We don't need that. And I'm not going to the new media, which, whoops, I went too quick. The new media, which is now horizontal control. You have soundtrack albums and all of that kind of stuff that go with these films, or with the industry. It's not just simply making movies anymore. It's an entire empire of media. And so there it is. We come to the end, and it just means remember all these things, and bye. They cut me off. Okay, I went through very quickly at the end of that, but it's it doesn't matter that much because you've got it on your yes. Any questions? Oh,